Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I am John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's the most shocking thing you learned about someone after their death? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe.
There was this man I worked with at Walmart some years back. Always a nice guy, helpful, etc. Turns out he passed away a few months ago. He was in his 60s, I think. The circumstances of his death left me depressed and just sad. He apparently died alone with his power cut off because he couldn't afford the bill. People didn't find out about him until a week or so later after he died. I still think about him almost every day. Even though he more than likely forgot who I was, we didn't have any interaction outside of work. It saddens me greatly to learn how he died. I had a great aunt that lived with her son. Actually, her son lived with her, but we found effing nasty pictures of them effing. I think my mom had a suspicion it was going on. They both died around the same time, and my mom ended up as executor, or whatever, of the estate. I remember her specifically saying not to look at any pictures we found, but I had no idea why until I looked at them. My great aunt died about a year ago. She was in her mid-70s. We were unpacking all her things, and we found her diaries, some from years ago and some from just before her death. In her diaries, she had mentioned that she despised her sister. To be honest, none of us liked her, and didn't like a lot of my cousins. Most shocking, she kept on talking about a man who she called Monster. This man had been harassing her for abusing her for years. She never mentioned it, nor indicated that anything was wrong. We suspect that it was her boss. I loved her dearly. She was so sweet. I had an aunt who was severely disabled most of her life and confined to a wheelchair. I was surprised to find out after she died she had a lover most of her life with similar disabilities who passed away shortly before her. I'm glad she had someone in her life like that. A few years ago, after my great aunt passed away, we found out that she had a daughter no one in our family knew about. The daughter, who I'll call M, had been put up for adoption when my aunt was very young. M had been searching for her missing side of the family since she was young, and was in her 50s when she finally found us. Unfortunately, she never got to meet her biological mother, but she and her daughters couldn't be happier to have found us, and we have welcomed them with open arms. My family is very musically inclined, and several of us played instruments, my great aunt included. M's daughter is very musically talented and always says that she never knew where she got it from until she met us. Her daughter told us that learning there was this whole side of her family who's just like her was on her greatest moments of her life. M acts and talks exactly like my aunt did, always saying quirky stuff and being very animated, which fascinates me because she never was able to grow up and live with my aunt. My family is very close-knit, and it hit really hard when my aunt passed away. So finding this woman who's my aunt made over has been such a blessing. Sorry for the long story. I just love telling it. After my grandpa died, I found out that he had stolen $176,000 from a trust fund meant for my brother and I, and that he had taken it out mainly in 3 lump sums for gambling. That my friend or coworker would talk about me to his family in good terms, of course. When he passed from cancer last year, I met his parents and introduced myself as a former coworker. Told them that he was always really encouraging back in the day, when I always spoke of wanting to be a writer. His mom perked up and said, "Oh, he used to talk about you. He always hoped it would work out for you." I found that to be very encouraging. I cried a bit in the car as I was leaving the wake. After my brother's suicide, I pieced together that he had planned his suicide for years and used this long period of time to set my mother up to have a mental breakdown. He was a junior high teacher and also intentionally messed with his students by claiming that he knew his date of death. He gave them hints, which of course came true, and his death effed them up too. After his death, I found out my biological father sent a bomb to his ex-wife's work. My mom was pregnant with my baby sister at the time. Luckily, ex-wife had some weird feeling and reported the package. A bomb squad was able to do a controlled detonation. He got away with it. I learned 2 hours before my partner committed suicide that almost everything he ever told me was a lie. The hours after his death, I learned that myself and our daughter were actually his second family. I had been with him for 13 years. He had been with his wife and sons for almost 30 years. I have no idea how it was possible, that he kept two completely separate lives going for so long.
I actually know someone who did something similar, but I mean, he's still alive. And the two women slash families live in the same town. I mean, I just imagine he's just a giant ball of stress, but that's wild. Sorry, that happened.
My dad was an Air Force pilot who was killed in a crash during a plane malfunction. I grew up thinking he couldn't do anything and couldn't land, and that was it. 20 years after he died, I found out he had the choice between jettisoning to safety and risking the plane landing on the base and killing people, or steering the plane as far away from people as he could and going down with it. I hate that I grew up without a dad, but I'm glad he at least died saving people. Last fall, we discovered that my paternal grandmother had had an illegitimate child with a young military man who had just returned to the States at the end of World War II. When she passed away, we found a hidden stash of love letters that had been sent between them. At the time, we had asked her best friend, my godmother, about it, and she denied any knowledge of a former partner of that description. But thanks to family members who became enthralled with the concept, we discovered my dad and his brothers had a half-brother living only 2 hours away. Last fall, he welcomed us into his home to finally meet his estranged family. We discovered he had been very close to the family physician, who was considered an uncle, despite no actual familial relation. It was a very emotional afternoon, as my dad and his brother shared stories with the brother they never knew they had, even discovering that my eldest uncle, oldest of her legitimate children, was named after the family that adopted the secret son. After my great-grandfather died, my parents were cleaning out his attic and found his clan robes. The other is that just a few weeks ago, I was out having drinks with my dad, and he drunkenly tells me that my grandfather, his father, had a child with a woman in Japan while he was stationed there, and I have a Japanese uncle somewhere out there. This is off topic, but reading these surprise sibling stories reminded me of the depressing anecdote, so forgive me. In 2010, I had a young coworker at a shitty call center job. She was rambunctious and overly excitable, and while a nice person, could be overwhelming at times. She loved to talk about her twin sister, like all the effing time. My twin does blah blah blah. Yesterday my twin said, my twin and I are going to Mexico for 2 weeks this summer, etc. I never thought twice about it. She's stoked she has a twin. That's cool, whatever. 4 years later, I'm working as a financial advisor, and I get an older 60-ish client. We get to talking, and I'm like, I used to know a girl with your same last name. Do you know an Amber? He goes, oh, that's my daughter. Haha, small world. And I'm like, oh, weird. Whatever, and move on. Later, we're setting up some retirement funds and discussing, who he will leave his assets to once he has passed, etc. And I'm like, so you've only mentioned Amber and your wife, but Amber always talked about her twin. I'm sorry to pry, but is there a reason we're not including your other daughter in these discussions? He confirms the other twin died in 2006, 4 years before I worked with Amber, which effed me up for a while, because Amber always talked about her twin in the present tense. It makes me so sad to think about Amber and how she felt so alone in the world after her twin died that she essentially kept her alive by pretending she is. A few months after meeting her father, I tried to reach out to Amber, but found out she was in a psychiatric care facility across the country. From some heavy Facebook stalking, I gathered that over the years she had slowly started to unravel and could no longer care for herself, as she had tried to commit suicide several times. Her father told me last year that Amber was finally successful in joining her sister. It's the saddest story I've ever been a part of in my entire life. Amber's not a real name. Let's see, how to explain this. Found out after my mom died unexpectedly and my dad died of cancer that the man I was told was my biological father, absent alcoholic, was not. Found out my mom had an affair with a guy on her work softball team, and this man was my real biological father. Only now that his name was possibly Earl. Apparently she was afraid to admit this to her current husband, so he would be my bio father for the next 20 years. Luckily, I had an amazing dad who loved me like his own. My great-grandpa had a second family that he didn't see as often. He was married the first time for only about a year before his wife and newborn both passed away in a car accident, 1945-ish. Then he got remarried to my great-grandma, and none of our family knew he was still in contact with his first family when he passed away around 2010. It's really weird, seeing a dozen strangers at a funeral that all say they're related to the deceased, but the other 40 relatives had no idea they were still in contact. I had a friend who passed away in a car accident, 20 years old, and it was pretty devastating to the whole community. He was a great guy, but after he died, a ton of stuff came to my attention about him. For instance, he lied about his mother dying, as she was very much alive and had had a terminal illness. He had also told me he was near genius IQ and had chosen the pretty mediocre university we went to over the Ivy League because of scholarship money. He's still a great guy in my eyes, but it did teach me a lesson about gullibility. Not me, but a friend of mine met his dad's second family 2 days before the funeral. He had uncles and aunts fighting over the inheritance, wanting to make sure his half-sister got nothing, and that it all went to my friend. Totally effed up. He took care of her, though, so it really didn't matter what those asshats had to say. After my stepdad committed suicide, we found all the reasons why. The same night we called his best friend, who told us that my stepdad spent most of the days at his house. To his friend, he said that he worked at night. He put on working clothes and went back home to my mom pretending to have worked all day. His work told that he was fired months ago. Days after, letters kept pouring in, bills, thousands of euros he had to pay. In the trash outside, there were snippered bills he intercepted before my mom got home every day. My mom glued every one of them together to have a better view of everything. He also lent money in her name, about $15,000, which she had to pay back because she couldn't prove it that he had did it. At the funeral home, they found out that he still had his teeth. He never pulled them at the dentist because he hadn't been paying health insurance. He pretended a couple times these months to be in real pain, though, and his throat was so sore that he could barely talk. We think he must have screamed for hours in his car or something to sound like that to pretend it to us. To his parents, he said that he had a new car the week before and drove to them. The car was a loan. He also said that he found a wallet with 300 euro and had it in cash in his hands. We had such a fun day with that money, but my mom found out after he died that he just cashed it from his bank. He must have felt so horrible about this money issue and knew there was no way out. We still miss him. He was a very funny guy, and he taught me a lot in my teenage years, but boy, he did leave a mess behind, and his 6-year-old son, which I'm still sad about because his mom passed away too when he was 2. That my great-uncle was a badass Navy SEAL back in the day. My grandfather was a machine gunner in the Army who got his silver wings in 6 months back in the day, but no one really knew about his brother's badassery until the eulogy. Pretty crazy to hear all the stories we had missed out on. He was quiet and damn near blind as far back as I could remember. My grandpa, maternal, loved fried chicken more than life itself. He ended up dying from clogged arteries, heart failure, a heart attack, and something else. Not all of these at once, but in a short span of time. How do I know he loved fried chicken? He had specifically asked for KFC chicken on the bone for his funeral meal after we buried him. Funny, because I had just lost about 30 pounds for wrestling, and I couldn't digest food as heavy as that. So on the drive back to Arizona, I hurled the Colonel's goods all over. I was 14 at the time. Oh, and also, he had a collection of KFC buckets he kept. I don't know why, but this guy was licensed to kill for the government, and he loved his chicken. My best friend passed away about 10 months ago. His mother and I went through his stuff trying to figure out what to do with it. And this guy just loved kittens. I didn't know it. His mom didn't know it, but his computer had over 2,000 pictures of kittens doing kitten things. Phone had more. He had kitten pictures on the wall. That doesn't seem so surprising, right? Keep in mind that this guy was a roughneck to the core. He was this hard-shelled, rough-handed, manly man. He didn't try to be, he just was. Like 6'7", 270, makes Ron Swanson look soft and girly. And by God, he loved kittens. I found out that my grandfather had a fairly large playing card collection, mostly casino decks from Vegas, but also a few random other ones like a Jack Daniels deck and one of those military decks from Iraq with pics of Saddam Hussein on them. I found it in his house when we were cleaning it out after he had passed a few years ago. The reason this is so shocking is because I'd been collecting playing cards myself since I was about 12 and had never known that we shared this interest until he passed away when I was 22. For 10 years, we had a shared, somewhat obscure hobby, and neither of us had any idea. I now have all of the cards we found in his house, basically doubled my collection at that time. I offered to share, but nobody else in the family had any interest in them. But it makes me really sad to think that we never got the chance to talk about it. If there's any sort of afterlife, I hope he sees that his collection went to a good home where it can be fully appreciated. The Saddam cards are still sealed, and are the one deck I will never ever open, even though I'm super curious to see them. My grandmother died a few months ago. My entire life, she has always said she didn't have a middle name. Her mother didn't give her one. Over the years, I'd seen credit cards or various other paperwork have a middle initial on it. When I asked about it, she said she used her maiden name as her middle name when it was required for random things. After her death, her daughters and I were going through some of her old paperwork and found her birth certificate. There was a middle name on it. Her daughters had always been told the same as I had, and none of us, or anyone else we've asked, ever knew that she had lied about this her entire life, let alone why. Her sisters and husband of 60 plus years were oblivious as well. Weird. My alcoholic, gambling addicted dad had saved so many lives and was actually a good human being. He was a surgeon for 20 years in one of the top hospitals in the country, but the corruption is or was so widespread throughout the country that if you had a family member in the ER, you better pay some kickback to the nurse or doctor if you want them to take care of your dying member. If you're poor and unable to pay, most likely your family member will not survive. My dad, on the other hand, hated corruption and would never accept it. He banned his team from receiving kickbacks as well. He tried to save anyone who came to his care. So at his funeral, around 300 to 400 people came and said their final thank yous to my dad. But one person stood out the most for me, was this old man. He told us that when he got out of prison he had no money, no family, and he went to the ER after getting into some serious accident. My dad went beyond to save his life, then tried to get the hospital to forgive his medical bill. But none of our siblings really had any good relationship with him when he was still alive.